Well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Yeah. I don't know if I want to do the clap. The clap's too much energy in the morning, but I'll tell you what, let's all wake up and smell the pawpaws. Ah, it smells good. All right, so we're going to get started. We got a big day today. Lots going on, so we're starting a little earlier, although we're starting a little late. And we're going to start off and just kind of have a little quick coverage of some things at K-State, and then kind of, maybe cover some material that's already kind of been covered, but in a different way. And then we're going to move on and talk about a lot of different topics today, everything from the international aspect of Pawpaw, and we're going to have some other roundtables, and then we're going to have a whole group of different presentations. Excuse me if my voice holds up. And it should be a really interesting day. And then we have also an evening program, which I think will be quite good. So just to get started, just wanted to cover a few things that maybe we didn't get a chance to cover in some of the topics yesterday. But, we've all kind of talked about the native range of Pawpaw. I think we saw this and we've talked about Pawpaw, Simina triloba, of course. That's the one we're mostly working with. I had some parviflora down the hill for a while, and it finally died because it's not real well adapted to Kentucky. But we're working with Simina triloba. That's kind of the USDA map based on recorded reports of Pawpaw, but it's not real accurate. There's obviously going to be patches that they didn't find or find reports for, and are covered in a little further. But that's kind of the map here that Sheri put together a little while on the right side that kind of is where Pawpaw is being grown right now in the United States. And so it's really across and outside of the native range, but in similar growing zones. I talked to a friend of mine here from Minnesota, and I guess Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I grew up, is now kind of zone 5, so which I'm sure it'll be a relief to my mom and sister. But anyways, but it's, maybe now somewhere that we can grow Pawpaw too. So maybe the range is going up a little bit too. But we're going to face challenges with fluctuations of weather in these different places too. So anyways, because of that, and just the folks growing Pawpaw in a lot of different areas, it comes to mind, well, how is it going to do for cold hardiness? But then also, Neil alluded to this, do they get enough chilling, right, to actually break bud and both the flower bud and the vegetative bud? And so they might be hardy through zone 5, but sometimes we're going to have fluctuations that kill back the tree. But we're also worried about dormancy release, right? And so dormancy release is basically the accumulation of hours of chilling kind of between about like 42, 45 degrees and about 35 degrees. If you get warmer, it subtracts. If it gets colder than like that, then it gets down below freezing, you actually don't add any chilling hours. It's the number of hours in that area. And of course, we've been getting these questions. A lot of the varieties that we talked about yesterday, they're selected from northern climates. Can we grow those in further south, or are they going to have trouble getting enough chilling and won't really break bud? And so we really wanted to do a little experiment, and this was a master's student of mine. They went out to the material that we have here and also to Ron Powell's place. I want to thank Ron for letting us use some of his cultivars too, up near Cincinnati. And we were sampling limbs every basically week. And then we were bringing those into the laboratory and putting them under lights and in jars of water. So we started doing that basically in late January. And so the idea is when they get enough chilling, right, outside, and we can determine how much chilling they've gotten based on our weather stations, then we can see how many, whether they've received enough chilling to be able to break bud inside. And so we're kind of looking at, here's the dormant flower bud on the left side. Then we're looking for it to expand. And then we're calling that open, even though it's not really maroon, but you can see the female part of the flower is already receptive, so we're calling that open. And so we looked at that, and this is really some data from Jacob Vincent, who was also working on this, with another student. And this kind of gives you an idea then of how many hours. So they were just looking for like 25% bud break at the least. And that's kind of was the bar that we set to see if, when that's met. And that's kind of traditional in other fruit crops. And so if you look down the list, and it's a pretty long list, almost everything there was around either 650 to about 700. And we did this, a second student did another little study, similar study, and they did Susquehanna and Shenandoah, or sunflower over here, and they had a little higher estimate, and that was for 30% bud break, so just a little bit of difference, and they were running around maybe 800 hours. So we can pretty much firmly say that almost all these varieties actually have a chilling requirement of somewhere around 650 to maybe up to the 800 area. So it's not as much chilling as we kind of thought they might require for being selected in some of the northern climates, really. And so it may be, also another student of mine kind of calculated how many heating hours, right, how many degree hours of heat they were getting. And that kind of became the determiner of when they flowered, we think. So they have their chilling satisfied maybe in February here in Kentucky, but they don't flower because they need to get a certain number of heat units down to get the machinery up and running, right, and then get the flowers to come out, say, in the first or second week of April here in Kentucky. And so that's also important, and actually we saw some variation in the varieties of the number of heating hours that were required to get them to flower. So I think that's a whole nother thing to think about, besides chilling. So the good thing is, if you're in a really, if you're down in northern Florida, you're probably going to get maybe enough chilling most years to be able to have bud break. If you're further south, in like Miami, that's going to be a problem. But at least it gives us kind of an idea of how much chilling they need. I do know that we had folks growing down, and I went to a really great conference down in Violet, Louisiana last year. It was a really good conference, and folks were growing a lot of pawpaws down there. And I know that in Baton Rouge there was a planting, and sometimes they don't get enough chilling in Baton Rouge, but they would still break late, right? They'd still flower late, and they'd still get a crop. So I think that unless you're really like in that 200 or so 300 hour of chilling hours, which might be like further down in Florida, I think you're going to be able to grow most varieties that are commercially available right now across the United States. Now, I think when you go further north, it becomes maybe less about chilling and more about how much heat do you get during the year to ripen your crop, right? And that's why, like Potomac, if I was in Niagara Falls area, or I think Potomac could be a little dangerous to ripen up. And when we had a trial in Corvallis, Oregon, Susquehanna some years did not ripen up because it's a little bigger fruit a little later. It had trouble with the lack of heat that you get in the Northwest to really fully ripen up. So that's something else to kind of think about, is that some of the bigger fruited ones take a little long. That seems kind of a generalization, but a lot of the larger fruit ones, like Potomac and Susquehanna, Benson's not that way, so it's not a hard, fast rule, but it will take a while for those very large fruit to ripen properly, and some never do if you don't have enough heat units. So, two different kind of topics there, but I did want to bring this up since people are planting further and further outside the native range, including internationally. Just wanted to bring up just for a second about two things in this slide. One is insect pollinators, and then the other is, are they self-incompatible? Because we get that question a lot. And this is photos from this last year. Subis stepomegar is maybe out there somewhere. Yeah, there he is. He can wave. He did a lot of work with Pawpaw insects, pollinators, potential pollinators. So he had little cages he put out and captured all these insects over the course of 2 summers and then, or spring, and then took them inside and identified them. So that's a lot of microscope work, but he found a lot of different insects, a whole range of insects. And I think the big thing is we found that, flies, we expected that flies would be a major contributor to pollination. Lady beetles very much were also, as you can see it on here. And then we found ants. And that kind of brings up, there's a whole range of different insects apparently involved in in the pollination of the flowers in the spring. And how do you attract those? You know, it's something to think about. We talked about cat food or things like that to try and bring in flies. Because if you're in an isolated patch and you don't have a lot of genetically different pawpaws, you may have to try and bring in some flies to get different insects to share. But anyways, just some thoughts. So it was a good study to find out kind of what those were. But there's always that question of how many of them are really self-compatible, right? And so what should we be planting? And actually, another student a while back actually did this study and kind of looked at different crosses and selfing patterns. And this data is a little, I don't know if I can use this. We're going to try. I always have a little, no. I'll just kind of point. No, can't really point either. But up here we've got selfs, crosses, or other crosses, and then the number of trees. And if you look, well, like on Susquehanna by Susquehanna, we actually did have 13% selfs. So that was, you know, higher than we thought, actually. It's higher than we thought it might be. With sunflower, we didn't have any selfs, and there have been reports in the literature before about selfing in sunflower, so we were a little surprised by that. But then we looked at some of the other unexpected crosses, and we actually, so I guess we'll go down here with sunflower by Susquehanna, and we actually saw selfs that matched up for selfing then. So you know how we have been saying we were pollinating without protecting the flower before or after we pollinated. So what that means is that 11%, at least in that group of plants, the seedlings matched for selfing. So there must have been some flies following up on us, and they actually selfed a few. So what you can conclude is that we had maybe about 10% selfing in both sunflower and Susquehanna. And now we're kind of trying to get at this a different way now. We went and collected open pollinated, fruit just from the trees, germinated them, and now we're going to look at the DNA fingerprint, and we're going to see how many, just like out of 100 seeds from a tree, how many match the pattern of selfing. And that'll give us an idea of how many fruit really self, just without doing any hand pollinations too. So I think, based on this evidence and a little bit more that we already have that I'm not going to show you, some of these varieties maybe self at up to about 10%. Now, if you want to get a lot more fruit, you're going to want to have crossing. And so that means having genetically different cultivars next to each other with, flies. Or if you want to take and be the fly, right, take your paintbrush, move the pollen tree to tree, that you can do that too. So I do think it calls out that, you might get some selfing, and that's what we hear about. And we've got a pawpaw tree up in the Frankfurt Cemetery, which is kind of a big destination. If you want to go up there, you can go and see Daniel Boone's grave. A lot of people go up and see that. It's a steady line of cars, real ancient cemetery. Anyways, there's a pawpaw tree out there all by itself, no other pawpaw trees anywhere near it, and it's always got fruit. So we kind of think, it's selfing is what it probably is, because there's no other pawpaws anywhere nearby. So anyway, so that's something that people have been asking about, and we wanted to try and answer that question. Just real quick about the cultivars. I already kind of covered this. As we said, probably worth your while to buy cultivars or graft your own trees to get the best quality of fruit. Otherwise, the seed, you don't know what you're going to get. I will say we had a really great deal going with the Division of Forestry. You probably have seen this if you're following some of the Facebook sites. And the Kentucky Division of Forestry last year, I think, had 32,000 pawpaw seedlings and for sale. And you could buy them in packs of 10 for $40. I think it was 50 for $60, 100 for $100. And they sold out last year. 32,000 all sold out. This year, they opened up for sales last week. I waited 4 days to go check. They're already sold out. Now, I think they had far fewer this year to sell. That's what I'd heard. I didn't actually see the number to see what they started with. So, but anyways, you can find, seedlings to plant, start your rootstock in the ground, and then come back and top work the growing trees. That's a really good way to do things. So, just, we've already talked about this yesterday. KSU Atwood is a really good variety that you can plant, very mango-y, a very productive tree. Can get pretty large fruit too. depending on the season. At KSU Benson earlier, nice round fruit, which a lot of people really like. Then we got KSU Chappelle, which really is very tasty and has that kind of more banana pineapple flavor, right? And actually, this is, so you tell me, did everybody try the L81 yesterday? If you want to raise your hand, I don't know. But the L81 was modeled after, let me do it, Chappelle. It was because they brought a bunch of Chappelle fruit back. And so Daphne's ate a lot of that Chappelle fruit. And I think that really comes through with the flavor of the L81, because it's not as mango-y, right, as like Atwood would be. It's more of the kind of pineapple banana mango. And so that's what they used as their base. And of course, now we got KSU Dunnigan, and it was yesterday 7-1, right? That was 7-1. So it does have it's a very, very productive tree, and it does have a little more of that kind of, banana, pineapple, mango. It is a little seedy, but not too bad. It's just so productive, and it's a very vigorous tree. It really has good vigor. So I do think, it's taste trials, it did very well, and so that's why we're releasing it. I think it's a really good pawpaw, and I think especially if you're processing, it's going to be very productive. It's kind of like Chappelle, but with different flavor in a lot of ways. And then, of course, there's KSU Choice, which I'm going to call it that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And it's a little more mango. To me, it's kind of got some of the flavor of Atwood, but maybe a little different flavor combination. It's really very good, and a little less seed than Atwood. So it's a really nice fruit. I think it's going to be a favorite out there. And once again, the good thing is plant lots of different pawpaws, right? Because you want to, just like with apples, some people like Honeycrisp, some people like Gala. It's good to put a range of pawpaws, but you're also going to maximize your cross-pollination and get better fruit set. So it's a good reason to do that. And, as I said, Potomac came up. I think we saw, I don't know if we still have the giant Potomac here. Do you want to hold it up like we can all... It's radiance. Isn't that a huge fruit? Yeah, that's a Potomac. I don't know if Neil's here yet, but he missed it. Okay, yeah. But there's a good picture for you. So we've had some really large Potomac fruit out here too. That's probably probably the largest I've seen, but it's really got large fruit. So it is, definitely, I think, especially if you're trying to get a wow factor, it's worth growing. But you don't get a lot of fruit per tree, but it's still really something. And then Shenandoah, of course, I really do like Shenandoah. I almost feel like it kind of gets lost now in the mix because it is a really good tree. It is really productive and has really nice sized fruit, and it's not real strong flavored, but it's a really good one. And I think it's a real winner that folks should plant. And then, of course, Wabash, which I don't think is as widely planted. It really has a nice color. And out here it's been, it was really orange. And we kind of thought it's really a good one for processing because it'll have that deep color. And it does have some cracking issues, and we see that a little bit with Potomac too. So if you have a period of very little rainfall, and then all of a sudden it rains a lot, and you may have some phyllosticta, that gets on the fruit, and that way it'll crack easier. That can be a problem. And then Susquehanna, of course, everybody likes Susquehanna basically. The only problem is, of course, it's not the biggest producer, right? And it's kind of like I've got a Shenandoah at home, and it's probably got 75 fruit on it right now, and I've got a Susquehanna right next to it, and it's got 20 fruit, and that's kind of the comparison. That's almost year after year after year in my yard. I see that. But it's really excellent flavored fruit, and everybody really likes it. Some old favorites yet, NC1 is a really pretty good fruit. It won a lot of our taste tests, but once again, it's not a huge fruit. But it's good. It really tends to get a lot of phyllosticta. So if you get phyllosticta built up in your orchard and start getting black spot on the fruit, it can be an issue. And overlease, as I said, was like the industry standard years ago. So it really has a lot of good characteristics. My wife I don't think likes it as well because it's got that melon aftertaste. She's shaking her head back there because it really does have that kind of melon aftertaste. So some people are going to like that and some are not. But it's a really good fruit. And sunflower, as I said, is kind of our workhorse. It was selected in Kansas years ago by Milo Gibson, and it's a very productive variety, but not the largest fruit. And so we use it in a lot of our crosses, and I'll tell you more about that this afternoon, why we do that. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jeremy, and then Sheri's going to finish up.
With the microphone, since the podium one's not meant for people of my size. So for Pawpaw orchard sites, I'm going to go through this kind of quick. We are doing an orchard tour this afternoon, and so we're welcome to cover any of this again this afternoon when we're out there at the orchard and look at it in person. So for site selections, air drainage is something to think about. So you kind of want to avoid low-lying areas. So back on the backside of our farm, there's kind of lots of slopes and there's kind of a low spot. The cold air will flow just like water. It's denser and it will flow down those hills and pile up in the bottom. And I've actually seen down there in some frost events where you looked at the trees and from say shoulder height down, all the flowers were dead and everything above that was all fine. And that's because that's how much the cold air piled up and there was a sharp line there. Sheri and I always joke everything likes a deep, fertile, well-drained soil almost, but yeah, Pawpaw, it's a forest understory tree, so it likes a deep, fertile soil. Weed control is important. You would think that Pawpaw, since it's an understory tree in its natural habitat, it'd be really good about competing with stuff because it's kind of used to competing for light and resources in the forest. They do not compete well with weeds though, so especially when you plant your trees and they're young, you really need to have weed control. Water for irrigation is also important, especially when the trees are young. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then full sun. When trees are small, so if they're under 18 inches, they need some shade. Once they get above that, they will grow fine in full sun. You'll actually get more fruit production in full sun. So planting, you can plant spring or fall. So don't plant in June. That's something we struggle with here because with our clay soils, you don't want to plant when it's really wet because you can get kind of like a glazed pot effect inside the holes if it's a wet clay soil. Then the roots have trouble getting through with that. So here, our springs, a lot of times it's pretty wet in May yet, and so by the time it really dries out, we're getting into June. That is too hot for them and too sunny. And so when you put the trees out in June, they really struggle with that. So we've planted trees in early November. That did great. We've planted them in mid-March when they were also dormant. That did great. Otherwise, if they've leafed out, at least here in Kentucky, it's basically early May, after the chance of frost has passed because you don't want to burn the foliage off in a frost event. And again, irrigation. So for our spacing, we do 8 by 18 is what our spacing is for tree and row. You don't want to go further than 30 foot apart because, again, pawpaws are pollinated by flies and beetles, and they don't fly as far as what a honeybee will. And so if you've got trees really far apart, you're not going to get as much cross-pollination as what you would like to have. At 8 foot spacing, which is what ours are, I will tell you they will grow together at that. So if you've got trees just on an 8 foot spacing, the canopies will grow together. If you don't want that, you can space them, 12 foot apart or so. And then you can get about 300 trees an acre. And then if you don't prune them, we normally top them a little bit, but they can get about 25 foot tall out in full sun. We've got a couple trees out here in the orchard that we've never topped, that you can see kind of how big they will get. Weed management is important. Again, like I said, Pawpaw does not compete well with weeds, and so it's really important to do that. So we've tried a couple different things. We've tried, hay or wood chips, just mechanical cultivation, flame cultivation, which we have some flame horror stories of burning down pawpaw orchards with flame cultivation, and string trimmer. So what we do here now is early spring, when they're flowering, we'll go through with a string trimmer and take the stuff out, and then after that we apply herbicide until it gets close to harvest, and then if we need to go in and do some weed control again, we'll go back in with a string trimmer and do it. And so that's what we're doing here. So fertilization and irrigation. So the trees really like irrigation. They like a moist habitat, and so they don't want to sit waterlogged, but they need irrigation. And so what we do is we've got trickle emitters on them, and we have two 1 gallon per hour trickle emitters, and so they're getting a total of 2 gallon per hour. I may actually put a little bit bigger emitters in there, because like right now, even irrigating, it's hard to keep up with the water demands of like full-size trees with that. If you're not getting regular rain and it starts getting dry, you really need to be irrigating, especially when trees are young. Like the first couple years, it's imperative to have irrigation. We recommend irrigation all the time because, like now we probably wouldn't really have any fruit left on the trees if we didn't have irrigation on them. So for fertilization, when they're younger, you can hit them with 1 ounce of nitrogen per tree per year. After they get a couple years old, 3 to 4 ounces. So when the trees are in the greenhouses, we're hitting them with a 20-20-20 water soluble with micronutrients. Out in the field, what we're mostly using is urea now. You can also fertigate them out in the field as well with a water soluble. And again, you want to stop we don't fertilize after June, even in our houses, because you want the trees to shut down. If you're fertilizing later in the year, it invigorates them and they're not wanting to shut down. We put the urea down here like February, so when the trees are dormant is when we're putting the urea down. So pruning basics. So if you look at the picture there, it's kind of like the trifecta of what you don't want to have in a pawpaw tree. So we've got competing main stems. So we got 3 main stems there. We've got some crossing limbs, rubbing limbs, and narrow crotch angles. So those are all things you don't want to have in pawpaw, especially if you've got a grafted tree. You don't want to have competing main stems. Pawpaw is not the strongest wood on the planet, so those narrow crotch angles are weaker, and that you'll tend to have more limb breakage. And then the rubbing limbs, it will like rub a wound into them, and then it's a source for infection. So we prune dormant, so February, March is when we're pruning. So this is a picture of like 2 different pruning methods. So this was this orchard out here back in 2010. So on the tree on the left is a central leader tree, and so the tree on the right is a minimally pruned tree. And so I can tell you, working with those trees, the central leader trees are so much nicer to work with. So after the experiment part was done, we actually went in and kind of tried to convert all the trees to central leader. It took them a little bit longer to come into production, but they're just so much nicer to work with, especially if you're tall like me trying to get underneath trees and do stuff. Winter injury is one of the big things that we struggle with, and so it's also called southwest injury. So you see on the left there's like a dead strip on that trunk, and basically what happens is the trees they're acclimated to cold temperatures. You'll have a sunny winter day, the sun shines on the trunk, on the southwest side mostly, that gets dehardened, it loses its hardiness, the sun goes down, it gets cold, it can't get that hardiness back fast enough, and so now you've got that strip of dehardened material, the water freezes, the cells rupture, and that kills it. And so long term, what you get is basically that side of the trunk dead. So what we do to help with that is we paint them with white latex paint. So you can use indoor or outdoor. It has to be latex though, oil-based will kill the trees. We start when they're about 1.5 to 2 inches diameter, and we're applying this every 1 to 2 years. Initially, we'd hoped it could be like 3 or 4 years, but we've had to apply it every year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about pests. So there's not a lot of serious pests. It's one of the easiest crops to grow organically in Kentucky. So we're not treating for any pest diseases. Basically, our synthetic inputs are herbicide and fertilizer is our synthetic inputs. So our first one is some people don't even consider a pest as zebra swallowtail. So there's people that will plant pawpaw for zebra swallowtail. You can see the damage, feeding damage, and then you have the caterpillars, and they will kind of change colors as they grow, and then the adult on the right. So if you've got a full-size tree, these will never be an issue for you. If you have a small tree, they can defoliate a small tree. If I see them someplace I don't want them, I just pick them off and put them on a big tree is what I do with them. Ambrosia beetle, we talked a lot about this yesterday. So this is what the beetle looks like. You can see it's a very small beetle. And so what the beetle does is it will burrow into trees. So if you look at the trunk on the left, that's actually an American persimmon, but this was out at our farm, and you see like all those kind of like curlicues and wooden projections sticking out. They call those toothpicks. You don't always see those. That's the shavings from the beetle boring in and making galleries. But if it's, it rains or something, those wash off really easy. So in the middle picture, you can see, they're boring in and making galleries, and that's not actually what really hurts the tree. If you look around that, you can kind of see like a bluish discoloration outside where that gallery is. They bring in a fungus and inoculate the tree, and their larvae actually feed on that fungus, and the fungus clogs the vascular system. And so that's actually what ends up killing your tree, is that clogged vascular system. So on the right there is a pawpaw stem or trunk. You can see a gallery in that. So what we recommend, for one thing, is not to have a lot of dead wood around there. The grower that had these pawpaw trees infested, she had a giant dead wood pile pretty close to her planting, and we think that's what drew them in. Like we said, a lot of us, 2020 was a bad year for ambrosia beetle, I think because the trees were stressed. We were talking about yesterday, they'll give off ethylene gas, but that dead wood piles will also serve as a reservoir for them. So the next one is Semina webworm. So this can be a pretty devastating pest if you have it very badly. We had it for the first year out here in our orchards last year, but I know Cliff struggles with it a decent amount. So it is looks like a tent caterpillar. So on the left there, you can see kind of like those dead clumps of leaves kind of spun together with silk. So that's kind of what it looks like when you just would see them. In the middle, there's a close-up of one of those, and you can see there's a lot of caterpillar poops and dead leaves. You see where they've eaten the twig, and then on the right's a picture of the caterpillars. Now, they will get bigger than that. They'll get about this big, and then the moth is kind of like a nondescript brown. So I have seen pictures of these where they have stripped mature trees. I've seen pictures where they've eaten the bark off of like 2-inch diameter trees. They'll eat the fruit. So if you a couple ones you can just cut off, but if you have this bad, this can kill trees. Our next one is peduncle borer. I think I mentioned it to somebody yesterday. So this is a little moth. You see the adults on the right there. And initially, it was reported that it just burrows in to the peduncle or stem, and that usually is in the spring when it's flowering, and you'll just see those flowers wilt and die. And so we would see fruit that had signs of infestation on it. And so we took some of those fruit and let the adults emerge, and it turned out it was peduncle borer. And then they will also, we found, get into stems as well. And so that's like a small pawpaw seedling there, and you can see the gallery feeding damage in there from the peduncle borer. And so if something that size, it will kill the tree. On a mature tree, it's not an issue. And as far as like the fruit infestation rate, it's like 3 to 5%. And so it's not a huge infestation rate where you're going to lose all your crop. Phylosticta, fungal spot, this is something we see a ton of. And so it kind of starts out on the left where it's these like kind of purplish black spots with like a little yellow borders. It will then go where the blackish part dies, and then finally you end up on the right where that part drops out and calls bullseyeing. So it can look, that's all Phylosticta, it just depends on what stage it's at. So on the leaves, it's a cosmetic issue. It can get on the fruit as well. So the fruit on the left there, again, that's just a cosmetic issue. It's just black spots on it, just doesn't look as like attractive to buy. If you get very much Phylosticta, it will keep the epidermis from expanding, and so then when that fruit tries to size up, it will crack open, and at that point, that fruit's going to go bad quickly. And so in that case, it can be bad, like Dr. Pomper was talking about. If you've got like a large fruited variety and it's got a lot of Phylosticta and it gets a bunch of rain and it's been dry, you're going to have more cracking issues. So then we get on to like the fruit thieves, which is something like my dad struggles with his tree, Dr. Pomper struggles with. They can't eat all our fruit, but they sure try. Is raccoons and possums. And so these will eat fruit on the ground. They will also are happy to climb up your tree and eat the fruit out of the tree for you too. So I've heard stories of people like putting kind of like nylon stockings around the fruit to try to like protect them and catch them when they drop off, and like the raccoons like going up and like ripping the nylon stockings apart to get the fruit. So these can be hard to keep out, especially the raccoons. And so that's some of the pests and you're likely to see. And then I'm going to turn on, I think it's Sheri's turn. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Sheri now.
Thank you. So we'll move on into propagating pawpaws. There are two main methods to propagate pawpaws, pretty much any plant, and that's by seed or vegetatively. In pawpaw's case, that's by grafting. So one thing to know about starting pawpaws from seed, they're not true to type from seed, so they're not identical to their parent. I think Dr. Pomper made the comparison yesterday about being kind of like our children. You know, your child is not an exact clone of you. Your children have some characteristics of both parents, some characteristics of, family members. So if you eat, say, an Atwood fruit, you really love this, you say, oh, I want to grow Atwood at home, and you save the seed out of that. It's not going to be KSU Atwood, the seedling that you grow up. It will be a cross of Atwood and whatever pollinated it to create that fruit. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that's how you create new varieties, right? You make crosses of two parents that have characteristics that you want and then see what you get. So you just don't know exactly what you're going to get with seeds. Seeds do take a while to fruit, so 7 to 8 years from the time you plant a seed until the tree is big and mature enough to produce fruit. So grafting is the only method of vegetative propagation that works to propagate pawpaw true to type, identical to the parent. And grafting, you're using mature wood to graft, so it's faster to get fruit from grafting, about 3 to 4 years to get fruit from a grafted tree. So starting with the pawpaw seeds, you've probably seen them if you've eaten pawpaws, grown pawpaws. They're these big, flat, dark brown seeds, about the size and shape of a lima bean, 1 to 2 rows in the fruit, depending on the size of the fruit. So to clean them, what we used to do, especially for smaller amounts, we would kind of soak them in water, and we would sometimes put them in these mesh bags and just have the seeds in this mesh bag and kind of use it to scrub it together to get the rest of the flesh off the seed, because the pawpaw flesh kind of wants to adhere to the seed. There's kind of that little seed sac around it, so sometimes it's hard to get that off. Then we would rinse them in a 10% bleach solution, then rinse it again with water to just prevent mold growth and storage. There are commercial seed cleaners, so for people with nurseries, or you're cleaning larger amounts of seed, there are big commercial seed cleaners available, which we have one now that we use that's Bolden and Lawson brand. But there's other brands out there. So they're big, kind of use water and tumble the old fruit around to float it off, and then you get the clean seed out. So the main thing for successfully propagating pawpaws by seed is storing them correctly. So pawpaws need this cool, moist stratification period in order to germinate. So the number one thing is you don't want to let the seeds dry out. There was an experiment where they left pawpaw seeds just open to room temperature air for only 5 days, and that reduced germination to just 5% in 5 days. So you don't want to leave them out where they can dry out. So we store them in damp peat moss in the refrigerator in resealable plastic bags to keep them moist. So they need to be in something to stay moist. And you don't want to freeze the pawpaw seeds. Don't store them in the freezer, store them in the refrigerator. Storage in the freezer will kill the embryo and the seed and have basically 0% germination coming out of it. So they do need this cool, moist stratification period, so store in the refrigerator for at least 100 days. Longer is okay if you aren't planting them till later in the spring and it's 150, 200 days, that's fine, because they can be stored for up to 2 years with pretty much no drop in germination. After that, germination will start to go down a little bit year by year. And so if you store them properly, we usually get 85 to 90% germination. So you should get pretty good germination if they're handled properly. Then the seeds are planted about 1 inch deep. I'll use, poke them in with your finger. I'll go up to like the first joint of my finger, which is close to 1 inch. So pawpaws, as you probably know, have a deep taproot. And so we need to use deep pots to accommodate the taproot, which these are some different styles. We use the tall 1 tree pot that the brand is Stewie & Son that's close to a 1 gallon pot. They make 2 gallon, 3 gallon, up to I think 7 at least gallon versions if you're needing something larger, but something that is deep. So the ones that we use, the tall one, are 14 inches deep and 4 inches diameter. So the depth is what's important. As far as the soil mix, we use Pro Mix. I think the nursery panel yesterday talked about this a little bit. We use Pro Mix, which is a mix of 70% peat moss, 20% perlite, 10% vermiculite. So something slightly acid to neutral pH that has good water holding capacity but is well drained. As far as the ideal conditions to germinate pawpaw seeds, they do need pretty warm temperatures. So the ideal temperature is 75 to 85 Fahrenheit. We don't usually use bottom heat, but there were some experiments using bottom heat and did get faster germination using, those heat mats for seedling germination under the pots. And in our greenhouses, we do a 16-hour photo period. And also in our greenhouses, we use 30% shade cloth. When we did them outdoors, 50% shade cloth worked the best because it was just stronger sunlight outdoors, but the small seedlings do need shade. So remember, until they're about 18 inches tall, pawpaw seedlings are sensitive to UV light. So as far as irrigation, you want to keep them pretty evenly watered, so moist but not wet, well drained. Fertilization, we do a 20-20-20 water-soluble fertilizer. So Peters is the brand that we use, but Miracle Grow, there's lots of brands of the water-soluble fertilizer. We also do slow-release fertilizer like Osmocote to kind of top dress them. And you don't want to start doing that until the seedlings have a few leaves on them, because just the newly emerged seedlings, you can burn them with fertilizer. So we'll wait until they're a few inches tall, have 3 or 4 leaves on them. Pawpaws are fairly slow to germinate. The root comes out first, so the root will germinate in just 2 or 3 weeks, but you won't see a shoot emerge above ground for 8-10 weeks, sometimes more. People will kind of panic and say, my pawpaw seeds are not going to germinate. And then, it can take 2 or 3 months sometimes. Sometimes we'll even plant a seed in the spring, it won't germinate, and we'll just hold on to the pot, and the following spring it will germinate. I don't know why they do stuff like that sometimes. Usually you can get them up to a size that you want to graft or plant in 2 years. So one tricky thing is overwintering the pawpaws. Because they do need to go dormant in the winter. I think Neil mentioned yesterday somebody trying to grow pawpaws in like a subtropical climate where it was warm year-round, they couldn't go dormant. So they grew for a year and then they died. So they really need that dormancy in the wintertime. About 700 to 800 hours of chilling. So you think, oh, well, that's easy, just put the pots outside. Pawpaws are pretty cold hardy, right? Well, the roots are not cold hardy. So if the pot freezes solid and the roots freeze, then that will kill the tree. So somewhere that is cool, but not a lot below freezing. So if you have a walk-in cooler, which I know most people don't, some people that have, bigger operations might, a walk-in cooler is what's really ideal because it's consistently cool temperatures and it's not below freezing. You're getting those chill hours consistently. Otherwise, somewhere like a root cellar, an unheated garage is good. Some people bury pots outdoors. We used to leave the pots outside here and surround them with hay bales and cover them with a tarp. And that worked most years until we got a year that got to 20 below Fahrenheit. And that killed all of them. So if you're farther south, you might be able to get away with leaving them outside and kind of mulching around them or straw around them and covering them. If you're somewhere farther north, then that's a little too risky. So then moving on from seed to vegetative propagation, which this is how we propagate cultivars true to type, identical to the parent. And there's been several methods that we've tried that we'll go through, but grafting and budding is what we currently use. So stem cuttings. In the biggest study, a graduate student at University of Kentucky and KSU did this. Out of over 5,300 stem cuttings that she did, only one of them produced roots. So obviously that's not a successful method. You don't want to, take 5,000 cuttings in order to get one. So 0.02% success. They did a little study with root cuttings, and about half of the root cuttings would produce shoots, but they didn't want to grow much more of a root system. And there's also some other things that make it, just not very, very useful, because a lot of the cultivars don't even exist on their own roots anymore. So if you wanted to propagate sunflower, the original sunflower doesn't exist anymore, so there's not any sunflower roots to dig up to attempt to do that. But they just didn't want to produce much root system, and it can also be hard to see which one you're digging up if the trees are close together. So layering, this is what, I actually did this for my master's thesis many years ago. So layering is a method of clonal propagation where you root the stem while it's still attached to the mother plant. So you might be most familiar with it with blackberry tip layering. You can bend the canes over and bury them, and they will produce roots, and you can dig them up. So this is used in a lot of difficult to root species. So we tried trench layering, pot layering, mound layering, and someone else did some air layering. So the trench layering, where you kind of lay the seedling down in a bed. Pot layering, which is similar to mound layering, but it's in a pot. It's like you have the tree in a pot, cut the bottom off another pot, and put it in top, and fill it with some kind of medium, rooting medium. I just use sawdust. And mound layering, which is used a lot to produce apple rootstock. So we had between 10 and 20% success with this, which is better than the stem cuttings, but it's still not something that's really, commercially viable. And it may sound better than it was, like in the trench layering. It was only very young seedlings that rooted in trench layering. None of the grafted trees that use mature wood rooted in the trench layering. So it might have some promise, but it's still not a great method. Tissue culture is interesting. They can produce shoots in tissue culture, but they have difficulty rooting pawpaws in tissue culture. And there was a tissue culture company in Germany, I think some other people have worked on this, that said they had developed a protocol for rooting pawpaw in vitro, but we haven't really heard any more about it. So to be honest, I'm not sure what happened. I assume it was not really viable, that they either kind of a low success rate or just difficult to do, because that's not something that's done commercially. So how do we propagate pawpaws true to type then, since none of these methods work? We do grafting and budding. And so you can do this on trees in containers. You can do it on trees that are already in the field. And we'll go through some of these methods, but chip budding, whip and tongue grafts, cleft grafting, all work well with pawpaw. The only method that does not work well is T-budding. For some reason, does not work well with pawpaw. Can also do bark inlay grafts on larger trees. And so, as I mentioned, grafted trees take 3 to 4 years to produce fruit. So kind of the whole process, you collect the scion wood when it is dormant. So we usually do it in February. So near the end of winter, when the chilling requirement's satisfied, but before the buds start expanding. So you collect the scion wood from the varieties that you want to propagate, 1-year-old growth with good vegetative buds, and we store that in sealed plastic bags in the refrigerator until we use it. So the rootstock, basically any pawpaw seedling you can use for rootstock. You can't graft pawpaw onto an apple or a peach or something unrelated, but any pawpaw seedling will work. Ideally, about the same diameter for the rootstock and the scion makes for easier grafting, but you can do this on field-planted trees or potted trees. And we do this in the spring when they're actively growing and the bark's slipping, and it's when the leaves are usually, still growing out, but like 1 inch or 2 long leaves. So then again, you take that dormant scion wood out of the refrigerator and graft it onto the actively growing rootstock. And early May is the best time to do this in Kentucky because it's warming up, but it's not super hot yet. And you want to match up, so the cambial layer of plants is where cell division is taking place. So that needs to match up on one side. So if you have a size discrepancy between your rootstock and your scion, say you're doing a cleft graft, you don't want to stick the scion right in the middle of the rootstock. You want it to be off to the side where that cambial layer is going to line up on one side. So again, just good practices. Use a sharp knife, wrap it tightly so you've got that pressure kind of holding it together. Make sure you label it. And you'll see the buds start to expand pretty quickly, usually within a week, 2 weeks at least. But the complete healing can take, a month, month and a half. So you want to be careful, like when you're watering it, not to whack it with the watering wand and things like that, or it could knock your graft off. and take off any shoots. The rootstock will keep wanting to push leaves out, so rub off the leaves that are emerging on the rootstock. That will take, energy away from it. So these are the methods that we use. Chip budding. So budding, you just take a single bud from the plant you're going to propagate. This is good if you have a limited amount of scion wood. So say you have a little stick. With chip budding, you might get 3 grafts out of it. With whip and tongue, you would only get 1 graft out of it. So that's one advantage to chip budding. Whip and tongue actually has the highest success rate, though. It's got a lot of surface area. It's really stable. So if you have enough scion wood, whip and tongue is a really good method for pawpaw. Bark inlay grafting is how you top work trees. So basically older trees that are bigger diameter, you can use this method to, you make kind of this little flap on the side of the bark. And Neil Peterson did a really good video with us demonstrating it, so you can search for that online. But so it's a large diameter trunk. It's kind of scary to cut an entire tree down, but it does work well. It works best on trees that are about 2 inches in diameter. So the bottom left photo you see, that's a pretty big diameter tree. That was some that we practiced on. And it never quite healed over on trees that were that big, like 4-inch diameter. It didn't really heal over well. So if they're about 2-inch diameter, even though it looks kind of crazy at first, the stump with a little twig on the side, if they're about 2 inches or so diameter, that will eventually grow and heal over that. And since you're grafting onto such a big root system, you get fruit produced really quickly. So about 2 years, you will get fruit from a bark inlay grafted tree versus the 3 to 4 for other grafting methods. If you're not as experienced, the grafting tools are really good that, kind of make the cut for you. So they make this V-shaped cut. So if you're not as comfortable using a knife yourself, the grafting tools are actually pretty good, and we have good success with them. I feel like I need to go a little faster because I wanted to talk a little bit about, change gears and talk about harvesting pawpaws, which I think a lot of you are probably familiar with and we've talked about, so we can go pretty quickly. As Dr. Pomper mentioned, skin color, unfortunately, is an indicator of ripeness, usually green when they're ripe. And how you know pawpaw fruit are getting ripe, they'll drop on the ground. But for hand harvest, they will come off easily in your hand. So you can basically just kind of gently wiggle the fruit. It'll drop off in your hand when it's ready to pick. And you do harvest for about a 3 to 4 week period off of a single tree, which here in Kentucky usually ends up being basically the month of September, late August through late September. So as you know, they have a very short shelf life, don't store very well. You can pick them when they're just starting to get a little bit ripe. So a lot of people say, well, they ripen off the tree. They have to be starting the ripening process. So if you pick a completely rock hard, unripe pawpaw fruit, it will not ripen off the tree. But if it's just starting to get even a tiny bit soft, the ripening process has started and it will ripen off the tree, and you can put it in the refrigerator to store it a little longer or freeze them. So we avoid, processing bruised fruit, discolored fruit. Look out for the pentacle borer larva that Jeremy mentioned. The seeds have alkaloid compounds in them that will make you sick, so you don't want to accidentally, if you're making a puree with it, in the food processor, make sure there are no seeds in that. They're going to get ground up in your pawpaw. And one important thing, you don't want to dehydrate, make fruit leather, freeze dry pawpaw. We're not sure what happens. There's apparently some chemical change that happens, but a lot of people get sick to their stomachs eating, pawpaw fruit leather, dried pawpaw. So just don't do that. Just freeze it to store it. So this is what we used to do for smaller amounts. Cut the fruit in half, scoop out the inside, and then use either a colander and push it through with a spoon or a mesh bag and kind of squeeze it through by hand. This is kind of the next step up, this Roma food processor. There's a lot of other brands. That's just the brand we happen to get. It's a type of food mill. So you do have to modify this for pawpaw. That red spiral is the grape spiral that removes grape seeds. And obviously, pawpaw seeds are a lot bigger than grape seeds. So we cut the last 2 spirals off of that so it's big enough for the pawpaw seeds to pass through. And use the middle size screen, which is the pumpkin squash screen. And again, you just cut the fruit in half, scoop out the insides, put it through the top and turn the crank. That spiral removes the seeds and it gets pushed through the screen to kind of puree it. You do end up running it through a few times. You see there's quite a bit of pulp still wants to adhere to the seeds. So run it through 2 or 3 times to get as much as possible off. And this is what we currently use. This is more of like a commercial piece of equipment. So if you have a bigger operation, you can, we'd be glad to tell you more about it. It's actually similar to the food mill. It's just a big commercial version of it. You still, either peel the fruit, cut in half, scoop out, and put it through the top. And the inside, that drum has kind of rubber paddles that turn around, and there's a mesh screen that the flesh gets pushed through and comes out one side, the seeds come out the other. But you see how clean the seeds are. So this does a lot better job of getting the seeds clean than the food mill does. So generally processing, you'll get about half the weight of the fruit in the processed product. So say you had a 200-gram pawpaw fruit, you would get about 100 grams of that, pureed pulp. Bigger fruit are better for processing. They just have a lower percent seed. You'll get more pulp out of them. And we just store them in freezer bags in the freezer, thawed in the refrigerator. And I want to show this just for a second, but if Rob Brannon is here, he actually did this work. You can talk with him about this. Is a nutritional study of pawpaw. It was quite similar to banana, if you look at the whole table, which is kind of small, but pretty similar to banana nutrition-wise, quite high in fiber. So pawpaw is pretty high in fiber, high in potassium, fairly high in carbohydrates, but the nutritional profile pretty similar to banana. And this is from Rob Brannon's work from a few years ago. As far as where to either sell, if you have fruit to sell, or buy pawpaws, usually because of the storage, shelf life shipping issue, it will be local farmers markets, local produce markets. A few people have tried some online sales, but value-added products and selling to restaurants, wineries, breweries is kind of one of the most popular ways kind of to get around the shelf life issue. So we got to taste some of these items yesterday. These are some of the most popular pawpaw products on the market. The pawpaw beer, which we had to taste yesterday, wine, brandy, moonshine. So there's several places in Kentucky, Wildside Winery, Jephthah Creed, Sig Lusher, and Whiskey Thief, which did the pawpaw brandy yesterday, that are making these products. I know they're pretty popular. Ohio, North Carolina have a lot of pawpaw kind of beer and wine products too. So that's quite popular. Baked goods. So anything you make with banana, you can substitute pawpaw in equal parts in recipes. So like banana bread, it's also really good in like a pudding or a custard or something like that with kind of the creamy texture of the fruit. Hot sauces and salsas, something that you don't think about as much with pawpaws being so sweet, but there's recipes for mango hot sauce, peach salsa, things like that you can substitute pawpaw for. And I saw a pawpaw hot sauce bottle floating around yesterday. I'm not sure who's selling that, but there are some pawpaw hot sauces on the market. So pawpaw ice cream, we will have pawpaw ice cream for lunch today. So this is our recipe, and we also have recipe cards that are out there. I heard some claps, yes. So yeah, our famous pawpaw ice cream. If you want to make it yourself, this is the recipe. I like that recipe. It doesn't have eggs and stuff that you have to heat and make a custard and all that. So pawpaw jam. This is the jam recipe that we developed here, which we also have on some recipe cards out front. A really simple recipe. We experimented with some that used more spices and stuff like apple butter, but what people liked best was just the really simple where the pawpaw flavor comes through more. So that is our jam recipe. And that's actually the end of my presentation. And we're a little bit over, so I think we'll hold questions. Of course, Dr. Pomper, Jeremy, and I will be around all day, so if you have any questions about anything that we covered, then feel free to come up and ask any of us. Thank you.